The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific. Endless blue water stretched in every direction. White clouds drifted lazily across the sky. Far below the surface, something extraordinary was about to unfold. June 4th, 1942, would become a date burned into naval history forever. The clock showed 10:20 a.m. Four massive shapes cut through the ocean waves. These weren't ordinary vessels. They represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu moved in perfect formation. Aircraft carriers that had struck fear into Allied hearts for months. The same floating airfields that had launched devastation against Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their flight decks bustled with deadly activity. Commander Mitsuo Fujita stood watching from Akagi's bridge. This veteran pilot had personally led the first wave over Pearl Harbor. Confidence radiated from every line of his body. Victory had followed victory for half a year. Nothing suggested this morning would be different. Below him, controlled chaos unfolded across the flight deck. Deck crews in colored jerseys swarmed between aircraft. Zeros gleamed in the sunlight. Dive bombers sat ready for action. Torpedo planes awaited their moment, all being prepared for what should be the final blow against American naval forces. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck like mechanical serpents. Aviation gasoline created a sweet, dangerous perfume in the salt air. Aircraft engines thundered with barely contained power. Ordnance teams loaded bombs with practiced efficiency. Torpedoes were wheeled into position. Everything moved with clockwork precision. Admiral Nagumo would give the launch order in just 5 minutes. Victory seemed inevitable. American attacks earlier that morning had been pathetic failures. Torpedo bombers had been slaughtered. High-altitude bombers had missed every target. The enemy seemed to be throwing away aircraft in useless, uncoordinated strikes. But Fujita had no way of knowing what was already descending from those innocent-looking clouds above. A technological revolution was about to shatter Japanese naval supremacy. The weapon approaching would redefine aerial warfare forever. The question that would haunt Japanese pilots for years was forming in the sky overhead. How could American bombers achieve such devastating accuracy from such impossible angles? The shock about to unfold would destroy everything the Japanese Navy believed about itself. Their 6 months of unstoppable dominance were about to end in exactly 5 minutes of terror. To understand the magnitude of what was coming, you need to grasp how completely Japan had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Their naval aviation had crushed every opponent. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had surrendered. The Dutch East Indies had collapsed. Victory after victory proved Japanese superiority beyond question. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter was the crown jewel of this dominance. Pilots like Saburo Sakai had racked up incredible victory totals. Sakai alone claimed 60 confirmed kills. These weren't just skilled aviators. They were legends who had learned their deadly trade in the brutal skies over China. Years of combat had honed them into precision instruments of destruction. When they encountered American pilots, the results were predictably one-sided. American fighters were slower and less maneuverable. Their pilots were inexperienced youngsters, fresh from stateside training schools. The gap in capability seemed insurmountable. Standing on Akagi's bridge that morning, Fujita embodied everything the Japanese Navy believed about its own invincibility. He was a Pearl Harbor hero, a master of carrier operations, a true believer in Japanese naval supremacy. Around him, 4 carriers operated with mechanical perfection. Their combined air wings included over 250 of the world's finest combat aircraft. But 300 miles to the northeast, Something was happening that would have terrified Fujita if he had known. The Americans hadn't just been building more ships and training more pilots. They had been developing revolutionary weapons and tactics. Innovations specifically designed to exploit the one moment when carriers were most vulnerable. At 4:30 that morning, before dawn broke over the Pacific, something unprecedented had occurred. From the flight decks of USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, a new type of aircraft had launched into darkness. The Douglas SBD Dauntless looked unremarkable compared to sleek Japanese fighters. American pilots jokingly called it slow but deadly. This ungainly aircraft concealed innovations that Japanese intelligence had completely missed. The most distinctive feature appeared to be a design flaw. Perforated metal flaps along the wing edges looked like Swiss cheese. To Japanese observers, these holes might have seemed like poor engineering. They were actually the key to a tactical revolution nobody saw coming. These dive brakes could be deployed during attack runs. They allowed the Dauntless to maintain precise control while diving at angles approaching 80 degrees. Nearly vertical approaches that should have been impossible to survive. But technology was only part of the equation. American commanders had discovered something crucial about Japanese tactics. Combat air patrols could be drawn down to sea level by torpedo bomber attacks. This left high-altitude approaches completely undefended. It was three-dimensional chess played with human lives. The Americans were about to prove they had mastered the game. Everything appeared perfect for the Japanese at 10:20 a.m. Earlier American attacks had been easily defeated. Torpedo bombers had been massacred by Zero fighters. High-altitude bombers had achieved nothing but wasted ordnance. The Americans seemed to be proving Japanese superiority with every failed attack. Admiral Nagumo felt confident enough to continue his planned second strike against Midway. Across every flight deck, ordnance crews worked frantically. Bombs intended for ground targets were being swapped for ship-killing weapons. Armor-piercing bombs replaced general-purpose ordnance. Torpedoes were loaded for the hunt to find and destroy American ships. Aviation gasoline flowed freely as fuel crews topped off every tank. The long flight to locate the American fleet would require maximum fuel loads. It was exactly the vulnerable moment American planners had hoped to exploit. 4 Japanese carriers caught with armed and fueled aircraft covering every deck. Fuel lines running everywhere like arteries of destruction. Ammunition stacked in neat, deadly pyramids. At 10:22 a.m., a lookout's scream shattered the morning calm. The warning that rang across Akagi's bridge would echo through naval history forever. "Helldivers!" The cry hit Fujita like a physical blow. His head snapped upward. Eyes searched the scattered clouds above frantically. For one heartbeat, he saw nothing. Then ice water filled his veins. Shapes were plunging through the cloud cover at impossible angles. Not 1 or 2 aircraft, but dozens of them. Their wings extended into perfect crosses of destruction as they dove at angles no pilot should survive. Morning sunlight glinted off propeller spinners as they fell toward his ship, like bullets fired from heaven itself. The plump silhouettes of American Dauntless dive bombers grew larger with terrifying speed. Fujita would later write, his voice still trembling with memory, "A number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings. Bombs. Down they came straight toward me." What Fujita was witnessing was tactical revolution in action. 48 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from 3 different squadrons had achieved perfect coordination through pure chance. Enterprise's Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 had found the Japanese fleet first. Moments later, Yorktown's Bombing 3 joined the attack. Together, they represented the most concentrated dive bombing assault in naval history. The sound was unlike anything Japanese ears had ever heard. As each Dauntless deployed its perforated dive brakes, the slotted metal flaps created an otherworldly shriek. The Swiss cheese holes that looked like design flaws were actually acoustic weapons. Each diving bomber became a screaming banshee of destruction. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's attack. He had spotted the Japanese formation through a cloud gap at exactly 10:22 a.m. "Attack immediately," he radioed. 37 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives. At nearly the same moment, 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown began their own assault on a different carrier. Lieutenant Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, a young pilot from Kansas, found himself diving toward the massive form of carrier Kaga. Through his telescopic bomb sight, he could see Japanese sailors running across the flight deck. Their upturned faces were white with terror. Armed aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip. Fuel hoses remained connected. Ammunition carts were positioned between planes. It was every bomber pilot's dream target. The mathematics of dive bombing required split-second timing. Kleiss had to judge altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and target movement while plunging earthward at 250 knots in a 70-degree dive. The perforated dive brakes kept his aircraft stable. G-forces pressed him deep into his seat as the carrier grew larger and larger in his sight. At 2,500 feet, Kleiss pressed the bomb release. His 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb separated cleanly from the aircraft. Its yellow nose cone gleamed as it continued downward. Kleiss pulled out of his dive with force that nearly caused him to black out. Across the Japanese formation, the impossible was happening. On Akagi, Fujita threw himself behind a command post as two massive explosions rocked his ship. The first bomb struck just behind the midship elevator. The second hit near the port side of the flight deck. Under normal circumstances, these hits wouldn't have been fatal to a ship as large as Akagi. But with the flight deck crowded with fuel and armed aircraft, the results were catastrophic. Fujita watched in horror as secondary explosions began chain-reacting across his ship. There was a huge hole in the flight deck just behind the midship elevator, he remembered. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled upward in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flame and jet-black smoke. The scene was being repeated with terrifying precision on Kaga and Soryu. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading a small section of Enterprise dive bombers, achieved something no pilot in history had ever done. He scored direct hits on two different enemy aircraft carriers in a single attack. His first bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar. The explosion set off a chain reaction among stored torpedoes and bombs. Minutes later, he put another bomb through the flight deck of carrier Soryu. On Soryu, the devastation was immediate and total. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck within minutes. The ship was transformed into what one survivor called a hell of smoke and flames. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, beloved by his crew, chose to go down with his ship. He stood on the bridge, sword in hand, calmly singing Kimigayo, the Japanese national anthem, as flames consumed his command. The most shocking aspect wasn't just the destruction, it was the precision. American dive bombers, operating from carriers hundreds of miles away, had achieved accuracy that Japanese planners thought impossible. The perforated dive brakes that looked so crude had enabled bombing precision that turned each Dauntless into a guided missile with a human brain. But perhaps no Japanese pilot experienced the shock of American capabilities more dramatically than Saburo Sakai. Japan's most famous ace encountered American bombers on August 7, 1942, over Guadalcanal. Flying his Zero at 13,000 feet, Sakai spotted what appeared to be 8 American F-4F Wildcat fighters circling below. Easy prey for a pilot with 60 victories. "I was in a trap," Sakai later wrote, his voice still filled with disbelief decades later. The enemy planes were not fighters, but bombers. Avenger torpedo planes, types I had never seen before. From the rear, they looked exactly like Wildcats. What happened next shattered every assumption Japanese pilots had about American bomber aircraft. As Sakai closed for what should have been an easy kill, 8 tail gunners opened fire simultaneously. The Dauntless wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying fortress with defensive firepower that could challenge the best fighter pilots in the world. There was only one thing to do, Sakai remembered. Keep going and open up with everything I had. I jammed down on the firing button. Almost at the same moment, every gun in the formation opened up. The planes were only 20 yards in front of me when flames spurted from 2 bombers. That was all I saw. A violent explosion smashed at my body. I felt as though knives had been thrust savagely into my ears. The world burst into flaming red, and I went blind. Multiple .30 caliber bullets had shattered Sakai's canopy and struck him in the head, chest, and legs. One tracer round missed his right eye by less than an inch, melting the rim of his goggles. The tail gunners had expended over 1,000 rounds of ammunition in seconds, turning Japan's greatest ace into a casualty. What followed was one of aviation history's most remarkable flights. Nearly blind, badly wounded, and with his aircraft riddled with holes, Sakai flew 550 miles back to Rabaul. He navigated by instinct and willpower alone. When he finally landed, his fuel tanks were completely empty. He would spend the next 18 months in hospitals, recovering from wounds inflicted by aircraft he had thought were easy targets. In exactly 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the entire balance of power in the Pacific Ocean had shifted forever. 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were now flaming wreckage. Their flight decks had become twisted metal graveyards where moments before they had been symbols of invincible power. Mitsuo Fujita, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself being lowered on a stretcher to a rescue boat. Both ankles were broken from his desperate escape from Akagi's burning bridge. As he was transferred to the cruiser Nagara, he watched his flagship disappear beneath the waves at 4:55 a.m. the next morning, torn apart by torpedoes from her own escort destroyers. The human cost was staggering. Of Akagi's crew of nearly 2,000 men, only 263 would survive. Captain Aoki, who had initially planned to go down with his ship, was finally persuaded to abandon the vessel. But not before the inferno had claimed every man trapped in the engine rooms below. These weren't just statistics. They were the most experienced naval aviators in the world, irreplaceable veterans whose loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the rest of the war. What had made this devastating success possible wasn't just courage or luck. It was a technological revolution that Japanese intelligence had completely missed. The Douglas SBD Dauntless represented innovations that seemed minor but proved tactically decisive. Those perforated dive brakes, the Swiss cheese flaps that looked so crude, allowed American pilots to maintain control during dives at angles the Japanese thought impossible. A typical attack run began at 18,000 feet and continued at angles approaching 80 degrees until the pilot pulled out at just 1,500 feet above the target. The bomb displacement gear ensured that even in these extreme dives, 1,000-pound bombs would clear the propeller and strike with devastating accuracy. But perhaps most importantly, the Dauntless was designed from the beginning as a defensive fighter as well as a bomber. The twin 50 caliber machine guns in the nose gave pilots formidable forward firepower. The twin 30 caliber guns in the rear cockpit created crossfire that could challenge the best enemy fighters. This wasn't just a bomber that could defend itself, it was a multi-role aircraft that redefined what carrier aviation could accomplish. For Japanese pilots like Saburo Sakai, the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical wounds. Men who had dominated the skies for 6 months suddenly found themselves outgunned by aircraft they had dismissed as inferior. The confidence that had carried them through victory after victory evaporated in minutes of defensive fire from formations of slow American bombers. Sakai would never fully recover from his encounter with SBD tailgunners. Though he returned to combat duty, he was no longer the invincible ace who had terrorized Allied pilots across the Pacific. The 18 months he spent in hospitals gave him time to reflect on how completely his understanding of air warfare had been shattered by perforated dive brakes and defensive firepower he had never imagined possible. For American pilots like Dusty Kleiss, that morning over Midway proved that technological innovation combined with tactical surprise could overcome any enemy, no matter how experienced or confident. Kleiss would become one of only 2 pilots in history to score hits on 2 different aircraft carriers in a single day. But more importantly, he had participated in proving that American naval aviation could not just compete with the Japanese, it could dominate them. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese offensive operations in the Pacific. With 4 fleet carriers destroyed and their most experienced pilots dead or wounded, the Imperial Japanese Navy was forced into a defensive posture from which it would never recover. Every subsequent battle would be fought on American terms, with American dive bombers providing the precision strike capability that made island-hopping campaigns possible. The technological lessons were equally profound. The success of the SBD Dauntless proved that specialized dive bombers, properly designed and tactically employed, could achieve levels of precision that changed naval warfare forever. Japanese attempts to develop equivalent aircraft would fail, partly because they never fully understood the innovations that made the Dauntless so effective. The story of Japanese pilots being stunned by American dive bombers offers timeless lessons about technological surprise and tactical innovation. In an era where military superiority can shift overnight due to unexpected innovations, the tale of perforated dive brakes and precision bombing serves as a reminder that confidence based on past success can become a fatal weakness. The 5 minutes that changed everything at Midway demonstrate how quickly the balance of power can shift when technological innovation meets tactical surprise. The Japanese pilots who had dominated the Pacific found themselves facing weapons and tactics they had never imagined, delivered by enemies they had underestimated. Today, when we look at preserved SBD Dauntless bombers in museums, it's easy to see just another World War II aircraft. But for the Japanese pilots who faced them in combat, these ungainly-looking planes with their perforated wings represented something far more terrifying. Proof that technological superiority could vanish in an instant, and that even the most confident warriors could find themselves stunned by innovations they never saw coming. The next time you hear about military technological developments or tactical innovations, remember Mitsuo Fujita crawling behind that command post as bombs fell around him, or Saburo Sakai flying 550 miles home nearly blind. Sometimes the most important victories aren't won by the strongest or the bravest. They're won by those who understand that in warfare, as in life, the capacity to surprise can be more powerful than any weapon. What do you think was the most important factor in American dive bomber success? The technological innovations, the tactical surprise, or the courage of individual pilots? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the moments when technology and human courage changed history forever. Next week, we'll explore how American submarine warfare evolved to counter Japanese innovations in the same Pacific theater. Until then, remember that sometimes the most dramatic victories come from the weapons nobody sees coming.